Peter, thank you so much. I really appreciate you making the time. I'm very excited about this. As I was just mentioning before, this is my first conversation around Israel-Palestine and the whole conflict of many that I'm going to have that I have on the docket coming up, and hopefully more that are unscheduled as well. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, again, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. The way that this usually starts is I ask about your story. What is your story? What brought you to where you are today? And what have you been working on? And all those great things. So wherever you want to start that.
Sure. I grew up in the Boston area. My parents are Jewish immigrants from South Africa, came just before I was born. So the experience of South Africa loomed very large in my family growing up. It was especially in the time period that I was kind of coming of age in the 1980s. It was the state of emergency in South Africa, the increasing violence there, the anti-apartheid movement. I spent a lot of time in South Africa as a kid because both of my parents' extended families were all there. So we used to spend a fair amount of time there. So I think that my interest in politics probably stemmed in significant measure from that, because in South Africa, politics was a much more immediate thing in people's lives than it was in the United States in the Reagan era. And I think that I was also, since I know we'll talk about Israel-Palestine, I was quite interested in Israel-Palestine as well. My father was doing a fair amount of work in Israel. And when the first Intifada broke out in the 1980s, that I think captured my attention. And one of the dualities that has stayed with me my entire life about the time that I spent in South Africa was the duality of the fact that many of my happiest memories were in the South African Jewish community, which is a very traditional, very close-knit Jewish community where all of my extended family was. And so this was a place and a community that I really loved. And yet the people that I loved were finding through a series of rationalizations a way of rationalizing things that were going on that were truly horrific to people nearby them. And those rationalizations sounded, if you were kind of inside that discourse, they didn't sound so crazy. They might sound the rationalizations of apartheid. They kind of made sense to people who were in that discourse. Now, in retrospect, I think we can see that they were apologies for things that are just morally inexcusable. And so I think that as I moved in, went through school, started writing about journalism, started writing about American politics and foreign policy, a whole range of things which I write about. But one of them is Israel-Palestine, since I know that's what you want to talk about. I felt a certain similarity, not that the two situations are the same, but the similarity that struck me is this duality between feeling a deep love and a connection to a place, in this case, Jewish Israel, and the American Jewish community that tends to defend Israel, and yet feeling that this dichotomy of this deep connection and attachment to that community, and also the sense that there is a discourse that rationalizes things, excuses things that when you see them up close, you just realize are profoundly wrong. One of the problems is so many people don't actually see them up close. And beyond that, I think one of the things that has always fascinated me about Judaism itself is that I think one of the things that makes Judaism fundamentally different than Christianity and Islam is that Judaism is not just a religion with a universal message. It's also the story of a family that becomes a nation. The book of Genesis is the story of a family, and in the book of Exodus, that family becomes a people with an aspiration for sovereignty. B'nai Yisrael, the children of Israel, Israel being the name that Jacob gets after he wrestles with the angel. So this nation is imagined as this extended family that comes from the children of Jacob, the children of Israel. And I think this tension between universal moral obligation, which is very much in Jewish tradition, and the sense of familial obligation, kind of imagined familial obligation as obligation to this imagined extended family that is the people, Am Yisrael, people of Israel, Klal Yisrael, community of Israel, is something that I feel that I really wrestle with and try to find the right balance. So that's part of my story.
That's amazing. And it's an extremely unique perspective coming from South Africa as well in this exact situation. And there was one part that, there's many parts I want to go down, but there's one part in particular that I want to emphasize. And it's everything that I will want to emphasize in terms of this conversation is really to seek understanding and to spread the awareness of perspective. And when you were saying Judaism separates itself from Islam, Christianity in a sense, and you went down the familial route. I also, and there's so much debate on this about Twitter, but for me and for many other Jews, the connection to me personally, it's an ethnic background for me. I'm a secular Jew, which is very, very common in Israel and abroad. And the connection is the most simple way I could put it is I'm Jewish because my ancestry, when I got my DNA test and growing up, looking how I do and all these things, I was always identified as Jewish. I'm Jewish because I come from the land of Judea. That's what my ancestry ties to. And as someone who comes from Ireland, they tie their ancestry to someone who comes from who is Irish can tie their ancestry to Ireland. And that's because one way I've always explained it to people, and that's where the connection to that land comes from. I have friends living in America. We have friends from all over, right? We have friends who their ancestry ties to Africa or Greece or Ireland or Japan, and everyone I know feels a connection to that land. And I think you should. I think you should want to learn about your people and your family, your history, all of those things. So I wanted to emphasize that when coming to understand this conflict, that seems to be something, at least on the discourse of Twitter, and this is the Good of Twitter podcast. So that's something I wanted to emphasize, is that that's one thing that people don't seem to understand. And there's also, on both sides, there's denial of identity for Palestinians and for Israelis and Jews and Arabs. It's something I've come to understand a lot. And there's actually one book that, this one right here, Arab and Jew, the Pulitzer Prize winner by David Shipler. I'm about 450 pages into the 700-page book, but it's of all the books I've read, it's definitely been my biggest eye-opener. And that's just one thing I definitely want to emphasize. There's a difference for me, and even though this has, I'd say sometime in the last decade with Netanyahu's government, it does seem to have a more religious overtones. I was going to say undertones, but even more religious overtones than it has in the past, at least in the beginning of my life. To me, this isn't a religious conflict, and I think a lot of people see it that way. Saying all of that, how do you see this conflict? Do you see it as a religious conflict? Do you see it as a conflict of two identities, two nations? What is your perspective on it?
Yes, it's a conflict of two rival nationalisms. I agree. I don't think it's fundamentally a religious conflict. Two nationalisms, but two very different kind of nationalism. Palestinian nationalism, I think, is a fairly, I would say, standard kind of nationalism that develops within a colonial context. So if you look at nationalism in Africa, in Asia, what you generally find is that a European country draws some fairly arbitrary national boundaries, and then there's a group of people who are living under that colonial rule, and then develops a national identity around that border, and then struggles for independence. Right. So people often say there's no history of Palestinian nationalism. I mean, that's not really true. There was there's no history of Palestinian separate identity. That's actually not entirely true. But even if it were true, it wouldn't be saying very much, right? Because it wasn't like Nigerian or Indonesian or Ghanaian or Tanzanian identity goes back centuries either, right? These were arbitrary borders, but they became a genuine national identity in the struggle for independence. So Palestinians were struggling. Britain was given the colonial mandate after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And just as people in Syria and in Lebanon and Iraq were struggling for their national independence, Palestinians were doing the same, with a very, very significant twist, right? The twist is that starting in the late 19th century, there is a Jewish nationalist movement, essentially because in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the European empires are breaking apart, and there's a rise of nationalism in Europe as these empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, German Empire, Ottoman fall apart. Lithuanian nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, Hungarian nationalism. The Jews essentially look around and say, where do we fit in this? And there are a number of different answers, one of which is that nationalism will be overcome by some universal ethic, either liberalism or, let's say, communism. Others try to prove that they can be full members of these nations. But others argue that essentially take a kind of apolitical religious stance. But Zionism argues that essentially Jewish nationalism can't be expressed in Europe, that these nations, that nationalism, that nations will never fully accept Jews. Even more liberal nations like the French nation, for instance, won't truly accept Jews, that anti-Semitism is too deep, and that communism or liberalism will not transform these nations into ones that will accept Jews. And therefore, Jews need to find a home outside of Europe. And because of the religious connection that Jews historically felt to the land of Israel, that it turned out that the Zionist movement could only become a mass movement if it focused its effort on the land of Israel. There were secular Jewish Zionists like Theodor Herzl who might have been open to other places, but the mass of religious Jews in Eastern Europe were only open to the idea of a return to the land of Israel. So this is a movement that Palestinians just tend to describe, and academics in general try to describe as a settler colonial enterprise. And in many ways, it was a settler colonial enterprise in the sense that settler colonialism, which is also what we have in the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, right, is essentially the transportation of one group of people to another place, displacing the people who were there and creating a new state and a new society on the ruins of the old, with a language usually of modernization, of civilization, right? This was the kind of, this we know is the story of the United States, right? Built on the destruction of the Native American people of Australia too. So Zionism is a settler colonial movement in that sense. And people don't, many in the American Jewish community don't like to hear that, but it has, in fact, the Zionists themselves use the term colonial generally often to describe themselves. They saw themselves as a movement bringing progress, civilization to a backward part of the world. But it was also connected. What makes it, one of the things that makes it distinct is it was also built on this deep religious connection that Jews had to the land of Israel. Now, before Zionism, Jews had not tried to recreate a state since the end of Jewish sovereignty, 2,000 years ago. The traditional reading of Jewish texts had been that there could be no recreation of Jewish sovereignty until Messianic time. Zionism, which was primarily a secular movement, overturned that traditional reading and said, to heck with that. We need a country now. It's not going to be in Europe. We're going to create it. We're going to create it there. And one of the critical elements that makes this a live option is that the Zionist movement is able to convince the British, who are given the mandate over Palestine in the Balfour Declaration, to declare that the British support the idea of essentially a Jewish state. They use the term Jewish home, but essentially a Jewish state in this territory. Now, for the Palestinians, they're saying, like, what the heck is this, right? In the time of the Balfour Declaration, only 10% perhaps of the population are Jews, right? The vast majority of people are Palestinian Arabs, and not even all of the Jews are Zionists, by the way, because many of the Jews who were there for a longer period of time were not even Zionists. So for Palestinians, this is a completely unfair, essentially hijacking of their nationalist movement, which they expected would be like the Iraqis, like the Syrians, like the Lebanese, like the Jordanians, would lead to their state. So I would say those are the origins of the conflict as I see it.
I have a lot of pushback. Although I will say, as far as Herzl's The Jewish State, I read that, and it is described as settler colonialism, and we do return as conquerors. And some of it was Jewish terrorism, a lot of it was economic conquering, and then when it came down to the war for independence, then at that point it was a war for independence. So I'm not pushing back there. I do push back a ton on it was just the religion. There was a huge, and I 100% admit, there's a huge religious influence about where to put the Jewish state. 100%. And to this day, I think that's part of the big problem. When I see the oppression of Palestinian people, I think a ton of it is the religious influence. However, I'm not religious in any sense. Like, really, I'm not religious at all. I'm a very secular Jew, but I'm very proudly Jewish. And where I want the Jewish homeland to be, and I feel like it's an extremely important thing, as the way you describe it, I'm not saying you're wrong, but the way you describe it, to me, it could come off dismissal, and not necessarily dismissal to me, but I could see it being interpreted as you're dismissing, like, oh, Jews just wanted their own state because everyone's getting their own state. Well, Jews were going through pogroms all over the world. After the Holocaust, it wasn't like Jews were allowed to return to Poland or these places. Every time they tried to, there were more pogroms after the Holocaust. In the 50s, there were pogroms all over. In the Middle East, so Israel did expel 750,000 Arabs during the Nakba. In the Middle East, 1 million Jews were expelled all over the Arab world from around 1850 to 1950. There did seem to be like, and to this day, I believe, and many believe, for Jewish safety, for the survival of this story of people, this group of people, we did need a homeland, and the most likely place for us to make a stand and build a homeland is in our indigenous homeland, which isn't to dismiss the Nakba, isn't to dismiss the Yasin massacre, if you want to talk about that later on, and isn't to dismiss present-day Palestinian struggling. There was also a huge need for survival that went much further than religious context. And I know that Herzl and the Jewish State and other papers, they talked about, and maybe it happened in Madagascar or wherever, but your indigenous homeland, and not religious, it's just indigenous. And there's a ton of architecture. There's documents going back to Egypt from 4,000 years ago. I mean, there's a ton of evidence out there. That is where Jews came from. And with the Canaanites and a few other people who, unfortunately, either that identity doesn't exist anymore or the DNA doesn't exist anymore. I'm not 100% sure, but the culture doesn't exist from that exact land. That was and is, for me, like, that's the connection. That's why it needed to be there. And none of that is to dismiss the other experience, if that makes sense.
Right. First of all, I was talking about the origins of Zionism, which are obviously, obviously before it, we're talking about in the late 19th and early 20th century. So significant, at least 50 years, 75 years before the Holocaust, and certainly before the departure of Jews from Arab lands, which generally takes place in the 40s and early 50s. So my point was that there was a crisis in Jewish life in Europe. That crisis was, yes, because of anti-Semitism, but also because of the rise of nationalism. And it raised the question of what would be the place of Jews in a Europe of nations. And so there were a variety of different answers. Zionism was one answer. It was not actually the most popular answer, right? And many Jews also answered that question essentially by leaving Europe altogether, right? You have huge exodus from Europe to the United States and other places in the late 19th and early 20th century. My point was that what Herzl and other secular Zionists who tended to be more in Western Europe or Central Europe found was that although they were open to various different places, the only place that they could gain mass support for when they were trying to make Zionism a mass movement, especially from Jews in the Russian Empire and other parts of Eastern Europe, was the connection to the land of Israel. And I recognize that you may see this connection as simply the experience of being indigenous, but your experience as a secular Jew in the United States in 2023 is quite different than the experience of the way this was perceived by the mass of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia in the late 19th and 20th century. These were people, unlike you, who were deeply connected to Jewish texts. So their connection, that your secular language of indigeneity would not have been the language that the way they thought. These were people who were connected to texts, who were praying, multiple times a day for a restoration, for the restoration of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. And so for them, this was a secularization of their religious connection, the connection expressed in Jewish religious texts, which suffuse Jewish texts, Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, Talmud, others, to the land of Israel. And I think that the question of indigeneity of Jews is, I think it's fine for Jews to say that we are indigenous to that land. But I also think it's important for us to recognize that our kind of indigeneity, if we are Jews whose families have not been there for millennia, right, is a different kind of indigeneity than Palestinians, right, whose parents were born there, whose grandparents were born there, whose great-grandparents were. Now, there are some Jews who are in that category, right? But for many Jews, our grandparents were born in Eastern Europe or in Morocco. So you essentially have a very different kind of indigeneity than the indigeneity that Palestinians.
Can I jump in? So I think this is important. This is a point, especially on Twitter, but in this conversation, in this conflict, this is a point of contention. And I think it's important that we talk about this real quick. My goal here is not at all to dismiss the history of the land, the history of the Palestinian people who have been there for 600, 700 years, which some families have been there for hundreds of years on that land in their houses that have been taken away in this last generation. However, I highly push back on the indigenous part of that. And this isn't to claim rights over land or anything like that. It's nothing to do with claims of land or anything like that or nationalism. But if you're talking about an indigenous people, that's not what the Palestinian identity is. I think the Palestinian identity has much more to do with an American identity, which is this is a identity that's been formed through hardship and through their own experience as a minority in the Arab world, because both Jews and Palestinians are minorities in this part of the world, and Palestinians in two senses. They're minorities in Israel, and then they're minorities, well, they make up 2% of the Arab world. And
sorry, how do you mean that when you say they're a minority in Israel?
Palestinians are a minority in the border that Israel controls. Within Gaza, West Bank, and Israel, the Palestinian people...
They're actually a slight majority.
Oh, really?
Yes,
okay.
They're a minority of Israel's citizens, only about 21%. But they're small now. Majority of, if you include Israel proper, the West Bank, and Gaza, Palestinians are a small majority.
I also at some point, what got us talking on Twitter originally was Palestinian versus Arab, which we will talk about in a second. I'd really like to talk about with you. But as far as being indigenous, there are like Palestinians who are indigenous, but the vast majority, and they usually share blood, share DNA with Jews. The vast majority were coming from Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, other places. It's not. And again, this isn't to dismiss their right to their land, their homes, or anything. But when you say indigenous, like they're indigenous versus like the way it sounds to me is that you're saying, well, the Irish and the British in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts who have been there for hundreds of years, well, they're indigenous. And it's like, well, no, it's just a little different. It's not to dismiss it. It's just different.
Look. I think what matters, right? What matters is that when the Zionist movement was created, and so you had a small trickle of Jews coming with the aspiration of creating a Jewish society, if not a Jewish state. And then it was essentially blessed by the British colonial powers, right? There was a population, not just population, but a society, right, of Arabic speaking people who developed a Palestinian national identity, right, who were then dispossessed. So it's somewhat essentially like, if one wants to look at other settler colonialisms, how much does it, if someone tells us that the Cherokee had actually only been there for 2 generations because they had migrated from what's now Mexico, it doesn't really matter. The point is there were people living in this territory, and they were essentially, and they were dispossessed. They have been dispossessed. They continue to be dispossessed.
I agree, but again, you're misrepresenting. So like, take the Cherokee, or the Cree, who millions live in Canada now. Large percentage of that population lived in Northeast United States. They were dispossessed by Europeans. If they came back now, hundreds of years later, and conquered New Hampshire, they would be dispossessing the Americans that have lived there for hundreds of years. That's closer to the Jewish experience. That is much closer to the Jewish than vice versa. Again, because the concept of indigenous people, and this isn't to dismiss suffering, but like there does seem to be a need on the pro-Palestinian side of the argument. And my bias is definitely, I want truth and I want peace, and I definitely want the right of return in many cases, and homes being returned to Palestinian people in many cases. But my bias is I definitely have sympathy for Israel, being a secular Jew. And I've studied the Jewish history of this conflict for going back hundreds of years, thousands of years. There's a huge need to like change the narrative of, well, these are the quote unquote to Americanize the argument. The Palestinians are the Native Americans, and the Jews are these European conquerors, and it's just not quite accurate. Does that make sense?
No, look, I don't think having the question of it's totally legitimate for Jews to believe very deeply that we have this deep connection to the land, which we see as our homeland, right? What I would challenge is the idea that gives us superior rights to Palestinians, right? I don't have that's, and I think frankly, because I spent a lot of time reading Palestinian writing and engaging with Palestinians, I don't think most Palestinians have a problem with Jews asserting the idea that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is our historic homeland, so long as that claim does not confer upon us legal supremacy over them. And that's where the problem starts.
I'm with you there. I think it's important to understand the history and not to mischaracterize or to make caricatures of the side we disagree with, which I'm not saying you were in particular there, but again, when the words that we use, we need to define them. And because like, if you're going to say these, not you, sorry, we in the whole, if we're going to say words that can bring up different thoughts and different meanings, like settler colonialism, indigenous, Palestinian versus Arab, let's take a step outside of this conflict for a second. When you hear the word feminist, you probably think something different than your friend versus me versus a alt-right Republican versus a hard leftist. Like, it's important to define these terms, and it's important to get the words right. That's all I'm trying to do, because I agree with you.
Right.
It seems that we are
important to define terms. I agree.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we are very much in agreement, for the most part, about what we want to see happen. I don't want to see Jewish supremacy. I don't want to see people living without the rights they deserve. It just, when I see these conversations happen, I do see a lot of, well, like, you're indigenous, but we're indigenous. It's like, no, let's define indigenous, and let's just do these different types of things where, like, we should do that. And on that note, the way that you and I first talked, and I'm very happy it happened, was I can't remember the exact tweet, but you were tweeting about something with this in this conflict, and you said the word Palestinian when referring to Arabs in Israel. And I actually originally read this thought process that I have now in Noah Tishby's book a while back when it first came out, talking about the Arab experience. And there's a lot of stats now that will tell you Arabs in Israel, for the most part, for the majority, don't define themselves as Palestinian. They're Arab Israeli. And the difference between the West Bank Arab experience, the Gazan Arab experience, and the Israeli Arab experience are all very different. So how do you define, as far as we're defining words, how do you define Palestinian? Do you say an Arab in Israel is also Palestinian?
Right. So the first thing I would suggest is, I think if you're going to read and think about Palestinian/Arab identity, I would make sure you're reading you're reading a healthy dose of Palestinian writing on this subject. Look, there was a population of people there before the creation of the State of Israel, right? That population was both Palestinian and Arab, right? It was Arab in the sense that it was Arabic speaking, right? It was connected culturally in various ways to the larger Arab speaking world. It was also Palestinian because a national consciousness had developed, because a territory called Palestine had been created under the British, right? So again, in the same way that Iraqis were also Iraqis and Arabs, right? Then in 1948, end of 1947, war breaks out, right? A large percentage of the Palestinian population, the Palestinian Arab population, is pushed out of the borders of what becomes the State of Israel, right? And so you have this fragmentation of the population, right? Some people are in the West Bank and Gaza, which are at that point controlled by Jordan and Egypt, respectively. A group of people manage to stay inside the state, what becomes the State of Israel. Others go to other places, and so it's not, this remains one people. It's just that they then have a different set of experiences based on who they're ruled upon. The term Israeli Arab, right, is a term that is created to undermine the sense of a unity of the Palestinian people, right? Just to kind of create the impression that this is not one people. It is one people. I mean, if you look at the politics of Palestinians in Israel, this is one of the things that they assert very, very clearly, that although they are citizens of the State of Israel, they sometimes call themselves 48ers. They are members of the Palestinian people. So are they? Yes, there's different polling which will on the question of whether people prefer the term Arab or Palestinian. They're different. I've seen different polls on this question, but the point is that Palestinian citizens are both, just like Palestinians in the West Bank are both, and Palestinians in Gaza are both, and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Syria and Jordan are both, because one is a larger identity and one is a smaller identity, just like you can be French and European.
Okay, real quick. As I'm sure you know, here's the misstatement here. Palestine, the term Palestine, Palestina, wasn't the British that invented it. It was the Byzantines.
Right, but right,
yeah.
the British create a political unit after the end of World War One called Palestine. I'm not saying the term had never existed before. Lots of terms existed before. When the French created a country, created Mali or Niger, right? These were also ancient terms that got repurposed in a colonial context.
Interesting. Oh, I'm curious about that. So, in my understanding of it, the Byzantine Empire renamed the land Palestina.
Right. I mean, fine. I'm not disputing it. It's essentially, this is irrelevant to the.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was just curious.
Yeah.
So I need to talk to more. I'm happy I'm having this conversation now, because when I talk to Gaza and West Bank reporters that the conversations I have coming up, I can bring this up to them. And I am curious to learn more about how the Palestinian identity, just the whole of it, because I have not many, but I have friends who are Arab in Israel that I've met, and they don't describe themselves Palestinian. And in my sense, from what my understanding of it, in my readings, it's a national identity that has many people living in the diaspora, but not all Arabs who have been historically from, and this is just conversation with friends, not all Arabs who have been historically from that area for the last hundreds of years identify that way. So it seems to be difference of opinions around there. I'm excited to learn more about it. I'm still digesting how you would say it, and it is consistent. That is definitely consistent. If you're saying, because that was going to be my next question was, well, if Arabs living in Israel are Palestinian, then wouldn't also Palestinians or Arabs living in Jordan that were from that area, wouldn't they also be Palestinian? And when you said yes.
Yes.
Okay, so it is very consistent.
Jordan has a majority of the people in Jordan are Palestinian. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with Rashid Khalidi's book, Palestinian Identity, the Construction of Modern National Consciousness. But that's Khalidi is a historian at Columbia. That's pretty much the standard work, I would say, on the evolution of Palestinian national identity.
That's fantastic.
You might take a look at it, and maybe even ask to interview him.
Mm-hmm. Definitely will. Thank you. That's my questions at the end. Mm-hmm. One of the questions are book recommendations for what we are talking about in the conversation and for life. So that's awesome. I already have one. Thank you very much. I'll definitely look into it. And as I said, this is a journey. I'm very excited to dive in, and talking with you is my first one. I'm super excited about it. Again, thank you. I know my opinions will morph as I get more information, and that is the point. And the point is to seek understanding for myself, for my guests, for anyone listening. So any point of pushback I have, I just want to make that clear.
Sure.
Awesome. And then I know we have a little bit of time left here, so we'll kind of go more quickly here. In your opinion, what are the next steps towards peace? What does peace look like? How do we get there? Is there a solution?
I mean, I don't think that you can have enduring peace anywhere without some modicum of justice. So the question of peace for me is related to the question of how people are treated. You have Israel, 80% of the Palestinians under Israeli control, the Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, are not citizens of the country of the state that controls them. Right. I mean, Palestinian East Jerusalem can apply for citizenship, although even if they apply, they're not likely to get it. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza can't even apply. So this is a very profound form of oppression. If we think about the situation of Black Americans during the Jim Crow era, Black Americans couldn't vote, but they were at least citizens of the United States. Right, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are not even citizens of the country in which they essentially live, and the state is not accountable to them. It is accountable to the Jews who live in the West Bank. And when you have a state that is fundamentally not accountable to you, where you can't essentially influence the actions of the state and make it care about you, in those conditions, states tend to do terrible things to people, and that's what we're seeing. So and even the Palestinian citizens in Israel, the quote unquote Arab Israelis, we could talk about this, although they have the right to vote, are very profoundly second-class citizens. There's a very deep structural discrimination which exists in the very nature of the Israeli state that I think people don't tend to understand when they simply say that Palestinian citizens can vote. It's true that Palestinian citizens can vote, but there are institutions in the Israeli state that essentially are not accountable to them, that have a profound impact on their life inside the Green Line as well. We can talk more about that if you want. So one solution to this problem that's been proposed has been partition, the creation of a separate Palestinian state. I think that's extremely unlikely at this point. I think the possibility of creating a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank, given how deeply entrenched Israel is really impossible to imagine. I also think it doesn't solve two very central fundamental problems, which is it doesn't solve the fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel will still want equality, and they can't have equality in a Jewish state. So they will still essentially have their own movement for equality inside of Israel, by which I mean they will want to turn Israel from a Jewish supremacist state into an equal state, a state of legal equality. And Palestinian refugees want the right to return, right? Palestinian refugees say it seems unfair that Troy or Peter, whose families have not lived there for 2,000 years, can go there and get citizenship. But we, who were born there, or our parents or our grandparents were born there, cannot return to Jaffa or Haifa or Sfat or whatever. So partition doesn't solve those problems. And because I think partition is very, very unlikely anyway, my view would be that there should be one state with equality under the law for everybody, a binational state which recognized the national identities of two peoples, but gave everyone equality under the law in a state that did not favor people of either or any religion or ethnicity.
All right. I like it. I do think, just again, not to harp on the point too much, but when you have these conversations, it does add confusion when you're saying Palestinian, and it adds confusion to there just needs to be, if that's going to be how the conversation goes, when you're saying Palestinian, no matter where this person is living or how they personally identify.
I said Palestinian citizen to distinguish them from Palestinians.
Palestinian citizen is an Arab Israeli, is someone with citizenship in Israel. That's
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just for clarification purpose. So I would actually love to hear more about how they are second-class citizens, because I have read this before, where I haven't read like specific laws, because there are 60 plus specific laws for Palestinians in the West Bank that they are living under completely different
legal
laws than Israelis. Do those 60 also apply to?
No, it's different again, because Palestinian citizens, Arab Israelis, they have the right to vote. They are represented in the Knesset. You can find them even on Israel's Supreme Court. So their situation is different. It's definitely better than the situation of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. But I think to understand why they're not equal citizens, one valuable way of thinking about it is to think about land and the way land is allocated inside Israel proper. I'm not talking about the West Bank now or Gaza, right? So the vast majority of land inside Israel proper is owned by the state, 93%. A lot of that land was taken during the War of Independence when Palestinians were expelled. And the state allocates it for long-term leases and it's allocated through an institution called the Israel Land Authority. Now, the Israel Land Authority has 22 seats. 12 of the seats go to cabinet ministers, basically, or appointed by cabinet ministers, and the other 10 go to the Jewish National Fund. Now, the Jewish National Fund is an institution, a Jewish institution, whose mission is to develop land for Jewish use, right? Mm-hmm. So when this helps to explain why inside Israel proper, when land is doled out, it is almost always doled out for Jewish use and not Palestinian use. There has not been a new majority Palestinian municipality built inside Israel since 1948. This helps to explain why Palestinian citizens of Israel are 20 or 21% of the population and live on 2 or 3% of the land. And it helps to explain why, according to the last statistics I've seen, the vast majority of home demolitions inside Israel proper, I'm not talking about the West Bank now, are of Palestinian homes. Why is that? Because Palestinians can't get permission to build. Just as Palestinians are herded into overpopulated population centers in the West Bank, with Israel controlling the land around it, you see a similar phenomenon inside Israel proper. Palestinians are in extremely crowded municipal areas without access to grow into the land outside of it, which is allocated essentially for Jewish use. And so they have to build illegally because they can't have permission to build. And then their houses are, because they're illegal, they're slated for home demolition. So this is one example. Another example is that under Israeli law, you are not allowed a political party is not allowed to run unless it supports the idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, right? Now, the Democratic part was originally used against Meir Kahana's party Kach, right, to disqualify it, right? But it doesn't seem to be disqualifying Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich's party, even though they're obviously not believers in Israel as a democracy, given they want permanent control. But it means that the Palestinian political parties, Hadash, Balad, for instance, especially Balad, are always at risk of being disqualified from being able to run, right? Because under the law, you're not actually allowed. So what happens is the Israeli Elections Commission has repeatedly said they're not allowed to run in the elections. The Supreme Court has tended to overturn that because the parties don't really trumpet their opposition to Jewish statehood, but in reality, they do oppose Jewish statehood. Again, this is just an example of the way in which Palestinian political participation is really circumscribed, right? And in the way Palestinians don't have equal citizenship. I mean, one very simple way to imagine is this: if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, an Arab Israeli, right? Can you turn to your kid and say, you could grow up to be the prime minister of this country, right? You really can't, right? Because the basic mission of the country, the mission of the country is for Jews, right? You are essentially a kind of a guest there, right? It's not yours. And I think these are some of the ways in which this second-class citizenship expresses itself.
That's good to know. I'm really excited to learn more about that, actually, because as far as the second-class citizenship versus third-class citizenship of West Bank.
Right. Well, they're not citizenship at all. They don't even have third-class citizenship.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, we can talk about that more, but like I don't know much about the second-class part. That's not something that comes up as much in text. In books when I'm reading. I think I'd have to find specific articles, specific books to read more about that, because when going back to how do you find peace, it does seem to be a consensus recently, I would say the last 3 years-ish, that the two-state plan just doesn't seem likely. However, the one-state plan, the problem I find in that, when I know that Palestinians in the West Bank aren't citizens, one of the problems I find in that is that many don't want to be citizens of Israel. Many still do want the destruction of Israel and one state, as in Palestine. And with the current power dynamics, that's just not going to happen. So I don't find, unless it's like a forced citizenship, I don't know how a one state solution would come about anytime soon. But then that's like one of the things that when I hear apartheid and how you're from South Africa, I'm sure that's something that you talk about and think about a lot in terms of this context. I think it's like one of the big differences in my mind. It's always been there, is that from my understanding, Black South Africans didn't want to dismantle South Africa. They wanted to be citizens. They wanted equal rights. And that's not the chant. I mean, there's no polls I've ever seen that say that's what people living in the Palestinians in the West Bank want. They seem to want their own state, or a Palestinian state instead of the Israeli state.
Right. So I think we have to. Right. So I think. Sorry. Were you done, or was
no? Yeah. Go, please.
What Black South Africans wanted, most of them, was the dismantling of a particular political system, right, of white supremacy, and they wanted equalities. Originally, some Black South Africans actually imagined renaming South Africa as perhaps Azania was no name. Ultimately, they decided South Africa was okay because it was kind of a neutral name, right? But they wanted to overturn a political system based on white supremacy with a political system based on equality. So if you look at Palestinian political thinking since the creation of the PLO and Fatah in the mid 1960s and the 1970s, what you see at that period is a call for a secular democratic Palestine. So the idea would be that territory should be called Palestine, and that people of all religions, including Jews, all communities, should be able to live there equally, right? This was the kind of what you see in the documents put out by the PLO in the late 60s and the early 1970s, with some variations, but this is basically the dominant view. So when one thinks about Palestinian support for two states, right? Palestinians, of course, the Palestinian leaders had rejected partition in 1947, right? They were calling in the 60s and 70s for one secular democratic Palestine, right, where Jews could live with equality, but not with national rights. So it would not what happens is, because it becomes clear that that's not likely to happen, over the course of the 70s leading up to 1988, the PLO moves towards accepting the idea of partition in what they call the mini state, right, which is a state, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, right? And that's been the kind of era which we're in, right, in which the PLO accepts the idea of this Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And that discourse, it's true, remains resonant for a lot of Palestinians, especially older Palestinians. I think younger Palestinians are less enamored of the idea of partition, partly because they don't think they don't think there's any possibility of happening. Then the question, it's also worth remembering that when one looks at polling of Palestinians, there are challenges there, right? Most of the polling that one sees is of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. A lot of the Palestinians are not in the West Bank and Gaza. They're in the diaspora, right? Because they were forced out of the territory altogether, or they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. The Palestinian citizen parties, it's worth noting, Hadash and Balad, for instance, take the view that they support the idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza alongside a state for all its citizens, not a Jewish state, but a state in which everyone is treated equally, irrespective of religion and ethnicity, inside the Green Line. I think that historically, there has not been that much support for Palestinian support for my view, which is of a binational state, right? Palestinians don't want citizenship in Israel as Israel's currently constituted, because Israel is a Jewish supremacist state, right? They want equality in a different kind of state, right? And I think that historically that was imagined as a secular democratic Palestine. But I think if you try to think together about the needs and interests of both Israeli Jews and Palestinians together, and what that political process might look like, I think you're more likely to get towards the idea of an equal state that is binational, that isn't called Israel or Palestine, but is called Israel-Palestine, or Israel-Palestine / Palestine-Israel, because the terms themselves essentially represent the national characters of the two peoples.
I could see that. I question when you say the origins of the PLO wanting a secular equal rights. I'll have to read about it, but I question if that is what the want is, because in 1948, the 7 Arab nations that declared war wanted to wipe out the Jewish state completely, and there's a ton of literature that shows the Jews probably have been thrown back into the diaspora. And to this day,
what sources are you looking at?
There's a book. Yeah, let me look up the name. I think The History of the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. And then there's a lot of YouTube I've watched, a lot of literature I've read. But for example, Hamas in 2005, when they got elected in, they ran on their charter, they ran on the premise, we will destroy the Israeli state. We will throw the Jews back into the sea. There's video of it. It's in the charter to this day, updated charter, that they will destroy the Israeli state.
Okay, can we just stop for a second? I think one of the things, Troy, if I can, with respect, is I think that my suggestion to you would be to stick to academics, people who write peer-reviewed work, right? So on the question of Palestinian aspiration, the question of what the Arab armies wanted in 1940. Obviously, we don't know because they didn't succeed, right? But a book I would suggest you might take a look at is a book by University of Maryland historian named Shai Hazkani called "Dear Palestine: A Social History of the 1948 War," in which he looks at a large amount of Arab documented archival evidence, both the letters of individual Arab soldiers and also documents from the Arab High Command and the different militia forces, right? On the question of the Hamas campaign in 2006, after Israel's disengagement, and what Hamas's electoral platform was, I would suggest the work of Khaled Hroub, Hroub. I actually think it's not the case. It's true that Hamas's charter from 1987, 1988 absolutely is an anti-Semitic document, and certainly does not accept the existence of the state of Israel. But that's really not the campaign that Hamas ran in 2006. In fact, they very much de-emphasize that. If you look at
it's on the charter. It's currently today, 2023, on the charter.
Well, Hamas came up with a new charter, as you may know, in 2017, right? I don't know if you've seen him. What?
And it's still on there. I'm 99% sure. The only reason I'm not 100% is because you're saying it's not.
What's still on there? That Hamas doesn't accept
the Israeli state.
Of course, it doesn't accept the Jewish state. Palestinians, mainstream Palestinian, of course, Hamas does not accept the Jewish state. Palestinians never accepted a Jewish state until the PLO didn't accept a Jewish state until 1988. There's no question about that. To this day, overwhelmingly, Palestinians do not accept the legitimacy of a Jewish supremacist state. The PLO made a pragmatic decision.
So a Jewish supremacist state is different.
Yeah, but
hold on.
And I guess the question is, why would you expect them to?
No, I'm talking with you at this moment. You keep saying Jewish supremacists, and these words matter. I really do have a problem with the Palestinian civilian thing, because I know Arabs in Israel, and they don't define themselves that way. Not saying that none do. I'm not saying none do. I'm sure a ton do. But these words we use matter. So you keep saying, why would they accept a Jewish supremacist state? They won't. No one should accept a supremacist state. It's a Jewish state, which the Jewish state is the only one. Obviously, this is different in terms of of course, Palestinians care about this particular one. But from a global view, the Jewish state is the only one that people have a problem with. No one has a problem with a Japanese state, a German state, French state. And I'm not saying supremacist. Like, obviously, I have a problem. You should have a problem with a Jewish supremacist state. But a Jewish state, you should not have To me, if you have a problem with the Jewish state, that's a red line for me and many Jews.
Right. But I think the point is that a Jewish state gives Jews legal supremacy over Palestinians. When I say Jewish supremacy, what I mean is that Jews have legal supremacy over Palestinians, not in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, certainly, but even inside the Green Line. That's what I mean by supremacy. Now, when one is talking about other states, right, the question one would have to ask about those states, if it's, Germany or Japan or whatever, is there one religious or ethnic or racial group that has legal supremacy over another, right? That's the critical question. Does Japan, for instance, hold millions of people who are of a different ethnic or racial or religious group without citizenship, right? It doesn't.
I'm with you. Again, I'm not for a Jewish supremacy state. There are many
Jewish state.
I have.
Here's my question: what's a Jewish state that's not a Jewish supremacist state?
A state that has equal rights for all of its citizens, and let's not include. Hold on, time out. Hold on. Let's not include West Bank or Gaza. Let's say if Israel is able to fix its second-class rates for Arab Israelis, what you would call Palestinian civilians, if full equal rights is given into that sense, and there's these zoning laws and these building laws and everything's fixed in that sense,
right?
That's a Jewish state that's not Jewish supremacist. Germany, Japan, all these places, it's the ethnic homeland of Japanese people. It's the ethnic homeland of Jewish people. This shouldn't be an issue, and that's a red line. So that's like when I talk with people who are pro, how I would put in the bucket if we only have two buckets, and one's pro-Israel, one's pro-Palestine. I would throw myself in the pro-Israel bucket if I had to do that, although I don't like doing this, and I would throw you in that pro-Palestine bucket. And people that argue in that sense, these words are super inflammatory. It turns off. People stop listening. I listened to Mohammed Al-Kurd's interview with Lex and the other two as well, one with Benjamin Netanyahu. Mohammed mentioned 20 minutes of Benjamin and he stopped listening. And I know, and it was tough for me to get through the Muhammad one because he said that Israelis love genocide because they're committing genocide. And I'm not saying you're saying that.
No.
Words are inflammatory and this.
I'm terribly. I realize that I actually have another call at 11.
Oh.
So there's much more to discuss. I would love to discuss. I'm happy to do another round.
I really appreciate it.
I just realized I have to run now. My apologies.
That's okay. I really appreciate it. I have a lot to read. I've learned. I've got more resources to look at. I appreciate it. That's the goal.
Likewise.
Peter, thank you so much.
I'm happy to do it again. I really am.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it. Have a good day.
Sounds good. Take care.
Thank you.